There are mornings that feel completely ordinary. Mornings where the coffee is warm, the house is quiet, and the man you love laces up his boots, grabs his gear, kisses you on the cheek, and walks out the front door. You watch him back out of the driveway. You wave. He waves back. And you go inside, because you know he'll be home by noon. You know he always comes back. That is the last image Margaret Williams had of her son alive. A wave from the driveway. A smile. And then he was gone. Not in the way people disappear in movies, with screaming and sirens, and something you can point to and say, that is where it happened. He disappeared quietly, on a cold December morning in a small town in Florida, into a lake that would hold his secret for 17 years. And the people responsible for his death? They were not strangers lurking in the shadows. They were the two people he trusted most in the entire world. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This story begins not in tragedy, but in the most ordinary kind of happiness. The kind of happiness that makes people in small towns lean across fences and say, now there's a couple that has it all figured out. Michael Jason Williams, known to everyone who loved him as simply Mike, was 31 years old in the year 2000. He was a real estate appraiser in Tallahassee, Florida, a quiet professional man who took his work seriously, paid his bills on time, and loved two things above almost everything else on this earth. He loved his family, and he loved duck hunting. Those who knew him described him the way people describe men who are genuinely good. Not just politely good. Not good in the way that you perform for other people, but good in the bone-deep, consistent, show up and do the right thing way that is so rare it almost seems fictional. He coached youth sports when he had the time. He was the kind of man who remembered your birthday and actually called. His childhood best friend, a man we will call Scott Dunning, would later say on record that Mike Williams was one of the finest human beings he had ever known. And he meant it. Mike had grown up in Tallahassee. He had gone to North Florida Christian School, where he was the kind of student who made teachers feel good about their jobs. It was there, in the hallways of that school, in the easy rhythm of Friday night football games and weekend bonfires, that Mike met the girl who would one day become his wife. Her name was Denise. Denise Merrill, as she was known back then, was pretty and sharp-tongued and full of the kind of confident energy that drew people to her like a tide. She and Mike had been part of the same circle since high school, a tight group of young people in a small southern city who all grew up knowing each other's families and sharing the same church pews. Tallahassee in the late 1980s and early 1990s was a place where everybody knew everybody, where your reputation followed you from school into adulthood, and where the web of relationships could stretch so tight that there was almost no room to breathe. Mike and Denise were a natural fit. They got married in 1994 in a ceremony that their friends describe as beautiful and full of joy. The pictures from that day show two young people radiating the kind of hope that belongs specifically to people who believe that the life ahead of them will be exactly what they have planned. And for a while it was. They built a home in a quiet neighborhood. Mike's real estate career was steady and growing. In the late 1990s, Denise gave birth to a little girl named Ansley, and the family settled into the kind of domestic rhythm that most people spend their whole lives chasing. By December of the year 2000, Mike and Denise had been married for 6 years. To the outside world, to the neighbors who waved from their driveways and the church friends who sat beside them on Sunday mornings, they were a solid, happy, unremarkable family. The kind you do not think twice about, because there is nothing unusual to think about. But appearances, as this story will show you in unflinching detail, are perhaps the most dangerous lies we tell each other. Now, to understand what happened to Mike Williams, you have to understand the other man in this story. His name, for the purposes of this documentary, is Brian. Brian had grown up in the same world as Mike and Denise. They were not just acquaintances. They were not simply colleagues or neighbors. Brian was Mike's best friend. The kind of best friend who has a standing invitation to your house. The kind who knows where you keep the spare key. The kind whose name your wife knows and whose face your child recognizes. Brian was charming in the way that certain men are charming. He had a wide smile, an easy laugh, and the particular gift of making whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the room. He had married a woman named Kathy, and for a time, the two couples formed one of those tight-knit social units that feel permanent. Mike and Brian, Denise and Kathy. For people who did everything together, hunted, barbecued, celebrated birthdays, planned pregnancies on the same timeline so their children would grow up side by side. To look at a photograph of the four of them from that era is to see nothing but ordinary American happiness. Two couples, big smiles, cold drinks. The Florida sun stretched out above them like a promise. What nobody in those photographs could see, what nobody in that church, that neighborhood, or that town could see, was the secret that had been growing quietly in the dark for years. Brian and Denise had been conducting a secret affair since 1997, 3 years before Mike's disappearance. 3 years of secret phone calls, private meetings, stolen hours wrapped in the kind of deception that requires constant maintenance, constant lies, constant performance. While Mike shook Brian's hand and called him his best friend, while Denise smiled at Kathy over dinner, while two families sat side by side in the same pew on Sunday mornings, believing themselves to be exactly what they appeared to be. The affair had started slowly, the way these things always do, and then, as Brian himself would later confess to investigators, it simply snowballed. He would use that exact word. Snowballed. As though neither of them bore responsibility for the velocity with which it grew. As though it were something that happened to them rather than something they chose, again and again, over 3 solid years. Now there is a question that has to be asked here, because this is the question that sits at the center of everything that followed. Why not simply end the marriage? Why not tell the truth, file the paperwork, and move on? Denise had grown up in a deeply religious household. Her family had strong feelings about divorce, about the social shame of a broken marriage, about what the church community would say. And so, at some point during those 3 years, as the affair deepened and the desire to be together openly grew into something consuming, the two of them began to discuss an alternative. Not divorce, not honesty, something else entirely. They began to discuss how to make Mike disappear. Let that sit with you for a moment. Not how to leave. Not how to tell the truth. How to make a man who trusted them with his life simply cease to exist. The plan, as it would be reconstructed 17 years later from Brian's own confession, did not come together all at once. It evolved over months of conversations, of rejected ideas, of proposals considered and discarded. At one point, Denise suggested staging an accident on the Gulf of Mexico, throwing both Mike and Kathy overboard during a boat trip. Brian vetoed it. He said he was not willing to kill Kathy, the mother of his children. He said it as though this made him reasonable, as though drawing a line at one murder while planning another made him something other than what he was. They considered staging a robbery at Mike's office. Too risky. Too many variables. Then Brian had an idea. A hunting accident. Controlled. Believable. Clean. In the rural areas around Tallahassee, men died hunting every year. It happened. It was accepted. It left grieving families behind and very few questions. Brian and Mike went hunting together regularly, which meant that inviting Mike out to the lake would raise no suspicion. None whatsoever. And there was one more element that gave the plan a kind of urgency neither of them admitted easily. Mike had recently taken out a life insurance policy worth approximately $1 million. Brian Winchester was the man who had sold it to him. The policy was set to lapse if not renewed within a specific window. That window was closing. The pressure, as Brian would later testify, was very real. He told Denise plainly, either this happens before the policy lapses, or it does not happen at all. Denise Williams, according to the testimony given under oath years later, did not say no. On the morning of December 16th, in the year 2000, a Saturday, Mike Williams woke before dawn. He made coffee in the kitchen of the home he shared with his wife and 18-month-old daughter. He loaded his boat, checked his gear, and laced up his boots. Denise was home. Ansley was asleep. He kissed his wife goodbye. He told his mother, Margaret, the woman who would spend the next 17 years of her life refusing to let his name fade into silence, that he and Brian were going hunting at Lake Seminole, a large reservoir about 50 miles west of Tallahassee, straddling the Florida-Georgia border. He told her he would be home by noon. He always came home by noon. He drove out into the dark Florida morning, his headlights cutting through the fog that sat heavy over the road, his boat trailer rattling softly behind him, moving toward a lake that would never give him back. What happened at Lake Seminole that morning was not, according to Brian's own confession, anything like the clean, controlled plan they had rehearsed in their minds. Reality, when it arrived, was brutal and desperate and ugly in the way that all real things are when you strip away the comfortable distance of planning. Brian and Mike launched the boat together in the early morning hours. They were out on the water in the cold dark, doing what they had done dozens of times before. Then, at some point on that lake, Brian shoved Mike overboard. The expectation had been that Mike would drown, that the weight of his hunting gear, the cold water, the shock, would do the rest. It would look like an accident, the kind that happened, the kind people believed. But Mike Williams did not drown. He fought. He struggled. He managed to grab hold of a submerged stump in the water, and he held on. Brian would later describe those moments in court testimony that made the courtroom go completely still. Mike was in the water, holding on, fighting to survive, and Brian was watching from the boat. And then Brian picked up a shotgun. He fired once. He shot his best friend in the face. The man who had been his hunting partner, his childhood companion, the man who trusted him enough to ride out onto a cold lake before the sun came up. He shot him once in the face at close range. Mike Williams died in the water at Lake Seminole on the morning of December 16th, in the year 2000, murdered by the man he called his best friend. What followed was a performance so calculated and so cold that it requires a moment of silence to fully absorb. Brian loaded Mike's body onto his boat. He drove away from Lake Seminole, put distance between himself and the lake, and buried Mike in a dry creek bed near Tallahassee, several miles from his own home. Then he drove back. He returned to the world of the living and slipped back into his role so smoothly that no one around him noticed the seam. He joined the search party. When Denise called Kathy that afternoon in a panic, asking if anyone knew where the men were, Brian had already been back for hours. He told his wife he had gone hunting alone. He said he had not seen Mike. He let the search begin. He stood in the middle of the effort to find the man he had just killed, and he performed grief as fluently as breathing. The search for Mike Williams was extensive, at least in its initial phase. Officials from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission were called in. Boats went out on the lake. Divers searched the murky water. The early theory, offered quickly, accepted broadly, was that Mike had fallen from his boat, been knocked unconscious, and drowned. The lake had claimed lives before. The area was remote. It was not impossible. But there was something that gnawed at the investigators who worked the case, even those who ultimately closed it as an accidental drowning. From over 100 drownings recorded in the history of Lake Seminole, there had not been one, not a single one, in which the body was never recovered. The lake gave back its dead, every time, except for Mike Williams. His body was never found in that lake because his body was never in that lake. He was already in the ground, miles away, while the boats circled and the divers dove and the search teams called his name across cold water. 6 months after his disappearance, in June of 2001, a fisherman found some of Mike's gear floating in the lake. Waders, a hunting jacket, a flashlight that still worked, a hunting license with Mike's name and signature inside the jacket pocket. It was just enough. Investigators, looking at the gear, concluded that this was evidence consistent with an accidental drowning. A Leon County judge granted Denise Williams' petition to have her husband legally declared dead. The ruling came down quietly, bureaucratically, without ceremony. Michael Jason Williams, 31 years old, was officially a dead man. And Denise Williams, his widow, was now entitled to collect on his life insurance policies. She received $1.5 million. There were people in Tallahassee who noticed things, who felt things. Mike's friends found Denise's behavior after his disappearance strange in ways they could not quite articulate at the time. She did not go to the lake. When Mike's friends and family rushed to Lake Seminole in those first terrible hours, driven by the primitive need to be close to the place where something had happened, Denise stayed home. One of Mike's closest friends would later say on record that this was one of the things he could never explain away. "We couldn't get there fast enough," he said. But she never came. There were other things. Small things. The kind of things that only look like red flags in hindsight, when you already know the truth. She accepted his death faster than people around her expected. She moved forward with the legal declaration of death within 6 months. She collected the insurance money. And then, in 2005, 5 years after Mike had vanished, Denise Williams married Brian Winchester. The same Brian Winchester who had been Mike's best friend. The same Brian Winchester who had been on the lake that morning. Now here is where the story takes one of those turns that makes you go still. One of those moments in a documentary where you find yourself leaning forward, recalibrating, trying to fit the new information into the frame of what you already believed. Because the people around Denise and Brian were not completely silent in those years. There were whispers. There was discomfort. Law enforcement was not entirely oblivious to the coincidences stacked up in front of them. The wife collects the life insurance money. The wife then marries the dead man's best friend, the same man who was last seen with him. But whispers are not evidence. Discomfort is not a prosecution. And in Tallahassee, in the years following Mike's death, the case remained officially closed. Accidental drowning. Case closed. File in the cabinet. Move on. Except that one woman refused to move on. One woman who had known Mike his entire life, who had fed him breakfast and sent him to school and listened to him laugh, who had every photograph and every voicemail and every memory of who he had been before December 16, 2000, she refused. Margaret Williams, Mike's mother, would become one of the most determined private citizens in the history of this case, and arguably in the recent history of Florida justice. She did not believe her son had drowned. She did not believe his body had been eaten by alligators, as some officials had theorized. She did not believe any of it. And she was not willing to grieve quietly. She compiled 27 pages of notes, observations, inconsistencies, questions that she had written down with the methodical focus of a woman who understood that if she did not document these things, no one else would. She wrote letters. Not occasionally. Not sometimes. She wrote letters to the governor of Florida every single day beginning in 2009. Over 1,400 letters in total, sent to Rick Scott's office, each one asking the same essential question. Please reopen this case. Please look again. Please do not let my son be forgotten. She stood on street corners with signs. She put up billboards. She papered flyers along the roads leading to Lake Seminole. She called investigators. She called journalists. She called anyone who would listen, and a great many who would not. And for years, the world largely moved on without her. Denise and Brian built a life together. They lived in a house in Tallahassee. They raised children. They attended church. They showed up at community events. The official record said Mike Williams had drowned. The official record said case closed. And yet Margaret Williams kept writing her letters. By 2012, something had shifted. Not in the official investigation, which remained closed, but in the marriage between Denise and Brian. They separated after 7 years together. And Brian Winchester, the man who had murdered his best friend to be with Denise Williams, who had stood at her side and helped collect the insurance money and build a life on the foundation of that crime, was reportedly devastated by the end of the relationship. The thing he had done was permanent. The reason he had done it was walking away from him. And something in Brian began to come undone. In 2016, he did something that brought the entire buried story crashing back into the daylight. He hid in the back seat of Denise's car and, when she got in, he held her at gunpoint. He kidnapped her. He drove around demanding she reconcile with him. This woman for whom he had committed the worst act a human being can commit. He was arrested. He was charged with kidnapping and aggravated assault. He was looking at serious prison time. And facing that prospect, Brian Winchester made a decision that changed everything. He called the prosecutors. He said he wanted to make a deal. What happened next is the reason you are watching this. The reason this story matters. Brian Winchester, in exchange for immunity from murder charges relating to Mike's death, agreed to tell investigators everything. All of it. The affair. The plan. The lake. The shotgun. The burial site. Every detail that he and Denise had kept buried for 16 years, he placed on the table. He told investigators where Mike's body was. He told them what he had done. He told them that Denise had been involved in planning the murder from the beginning, that it had been, in his words, very mutual. Investigators drove to the location Brian described, a dry creek bed, miles from the lake, near Tallahassee. They found what Brian said they would find. 17 years after Mike Williams drove into the dark Florida morning with his boat trailer rattling behind him, his remains were recovered from the ground where Brian had put them. He was identified through forensic analysis. He was brought home. Margaret Williams, who had spent 17 years writing letters and holding signs and refusing to be quiet, who had been called obsessive and excessive and had kept going anyway. Margaret Williams finally had her answer. And now the question was, would anyone be held responsible? In October of 2017, Brian Winchester was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the kidnapping of Denise Williams. The day before his sentencing, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement announced publicly that Mike Williams' remains had been located and that he had been murdered. The word accident was removed from the record. The word homicide replaced it. Brian Winchester, the man who pulled the trigger, the man who pushed Mike into the lake and shot him in the face, received immunity from the murder prosecution in exchange for his testimony. He would not be charged with killing Mike Williams. He would never stand trial for that crime. He is serving 20 years for kidnapping the woman he committed murder to be with. In May of 2018, Denise Williams was arrested. She was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. She was taken from her home in handcuffs, the same home she had shared with her daughter Ansley, the little girl who had grown up without a father, raised by the two people who had planned his death. The charges against her were serious. The evidence against her was Brian Winchester's testimony, and the trial that followed would be one of the most watched criminal proceedings in the history of Tallahassee, Florida. But here is where the story takes its most gut-wrenching turn yet. Here is the moment that changes everything you thought you understood about justice, about guilt, about what it costs a family to finally get the truth. Because what happened inside that courtroom, what the jury decided, and what the courts decided after that, none of it was simple. None of it was clean. And for Margaret Williams, sitting in those courtroom seats, listening to the man who killed her son describe the act in graphic detail, none of it was ever going to feel like enough. That courtroom, that verdict, that appeal. And what happened to Ansley, the daughter of a murdered man, raised by his killers, who grew up calling one of them mom? That story continues in episode 2. But before we get there, we need to ask you one question. And we genuinely want you to think about it before you answer in the comments below. At what point in this story did you feel the first chill? Was it when Brian joined the search party? Was it when Denise never went to the lake? Was it when she married him 5 years later? Because the people who loved Mike Williams have spent 17 years asking themselves the same question. And none of them have ever fully stopped. Drop your thoughts below. And stay with us. Because episode 2 is where the walls finally come down.